Good afternoon, everyone. It is once again my great pleasure to be here today, this afternoon, to continue this series. And of course, I want to start by thanking Paul Davey, as long as the team of people that have been involved in making these presentations possible. Obviously, this is not something that's a one-man show. It requires a lot of help. And before we get going today in part 3, I actually want to go back to one of the first slides that I introduced yesterday, which was this little cartoon, this little diagram that depicts theory of evolution in an interesting way. This was published not long after the theory of evolution was formulated. And essentially, this represents the fact that out of chaos, something over time, we don't know how, we don't know when, has appeared and has been gradually changing over time into all of these different life forms. And essentially, even though we spent so much time yesterday in these two presentations talking about different aspects, we didn't actually leave this corner here because we've been looking basically at the fundamental laws of the universe, which is matter and energy and the rules that govern them, and asking the question, what is possible to bridge that gap leading eventually to the first cell? And so today what we're going to be looking at is a little bit of the rest of this story. And please remember what I started by explaining very early on, which is how I define the word evolution. The word evolution can mean many different things. In this context here, every time that you hear that word, what we're talking about is what scientists call material reductionism, which is to say that matter and energy on their own over time are sufficient in order to allow everything that is depicted here. Okay, so this is essentially what we're basically addressing in terms of a theory. So again, yesterday what we did is we started off by examining in part 1 the gap that exists between inanimate matter and animate matter. The gap that separates these two, and is asking the question, are there any empirical evidences that are allowing us to bridge that gap? That looked into concepts of physics and chemistry, and then we essentially turned to the cell. We stepped on the shore of animate life, animate matter, and looked at the cell. That black box that has been broken open, that we are now understanding more and more about the intricacies and complexities that are involved in cellular structures and mechanisms. And so today what we're going to do is examine another gap that exists between the single cell and higher organisms. We're now moving from concepts of biochemistry and molecular biology to now biology and beyond. Is it possible to find empirical evidence that allows us to bridge this gap? What's important to notice here is that higher levels of life require higher levels of complexity. And indeed, we started out yesterday by saying not everyone understands the cell, but everyone understands their body to a certain extent. And now understanding the cell itself, you can then imagine the body as being what? A cell of cells. And that's essentially the symbiosis, the relationship that exists between the cell at the microscopic level and the higher organism at the macroscopic level. And I want to take the time to read this statement here because there's a synergy, there's a relationship that exists between the cell and the body that is just absolutely profound. As each specialized cell carries out its own function within the body, its sole purpose is to accomplish the functions of the body. And the body, of course, cannot exist without the cell, cannot be without the cell. And so the body will then make sure to take care of the cell so that it can accomplish all of its own different responsibilities. And so you have this beautiful relationship that exists between the cell and higher organisms. And so what we're going to do is analyze this gap between a single cell and higher organisms, focusing on higher organisms and what is it that makes a higher organism what it is. And so this is obviously a very complex question, and so we're going to break it down into 6 different aspects. The first of these is control. We talked about how life is built upon information. And so essentially the mechanisms that allow this information to exist within the body and how it is regulated is where we need to begin. And so what we looked at in the previous presentation was a single cell. And we saw that all of the information is contained within the nucleus. It is from that place, from the head of the cell, that information will direct all of the different structures and all of the different mechanisms that allow the cell to do what it does. And so today, now, what we're looking at is the body. And so the body is made of all of these different types of cells, highly specialized cells in a three-dimensional structure. But again, the control and the presence of the information lies within the brain, which is the nucleus, the head of the body. And in this brain, this is now the new black box in a certain way. We understand more and more about the brain, but it is still something that there's a lot of mysteries that have yet to be unlocked. And so we have all of these highly specialized cells, neurons, that their purpose is going to contain all of that information and communicate with the rest of the body in order to allow all of the functions to occur. We think about electrical and chemical integration systems through which this information is being relayed, how it receives and transmits information, not just within the body, but also outside of the body as we are interacting with our environment. Think about also the eye. Darwin was so amazed about the complexity of the eye, and now we understand more about the eye in so many different ways. Its ability to peer into the environment that goes way beyond the cell. Because remember, a cell is only able to see its immediate environment, whereas we as higher organisms, through light that is coming from all across the environment, we are now able to perceive our environment at great distances. Think about seeing mountains far away, think about seeing the moon, think about seeing stars, okay? And it's incredible to see the different abilities that are built inside the eye that allows this dynamic living tissue, the lens, to change shape in order to automatically adjust, in order to be able to see something close or far in a very, very short time frame. And we also have protective mechanisms that will protect the eye from not having too much light that is going inside the eye. And you have the pupil that is going to contract and dilate in order to control the amount of light that enters into it to protect the sensitive photoreceptors. So again, quite impressive as we start studying these things. And then we have the ear that is able to detect small vibrations into the air, and with all of the inner machinery that is inside the inner ear to transform this mechanical motion into an electrical signal that is then sent to the brain and decoded as sound. And once again, there are protective mechanisms in there that are going to, like a little muscle, that when there's too much noise, let's say that you're listening to music that's way too loud for too long, and then you leave, you hear this sort of ringing in your ears. What is that? Well, there was a muscle inside the ear that recognized that there's risk for damage of the ears. And so that muscle starts to pull and disengage the whole system in order to protect the inner ear. And once you remove, it's gradually going to release so that you go back to the original position. And so again, all of these inbuilt mechanisms to allow the function and even protect the equipment that is inside of this. Now, we're so proud about all our technology. And as we look at all of these different things here, you can see beautiful analogies. You know, the brain, like a computer that is able to store and process through the different programs all kinds of information. You think of the eye with the camera that is able to capture images and transcribe it onto different types of media. And then you have the ear. You think about the microphone and our ability to speak, where when we are drawing air in and out, the vocal cords are being controlled in order to make all these sounds so that we can communicate information. That's again like the microphone and the hopala, how do you say that in English? Speaker, thank you. And so we're so proud of all our technology, but everything that we have made is in fact very little compared to what we discover is inside of us. Now, the second thing that we're going to be looking at now is that information exists independently from matter and energy, but needs to be expressed in a structure. It needs a medium for that expression. So what is the structure of light through which the control is being exercised? And as I said earlier on, the cell was imagined to be a bag filled with jello, with protoplasm, something that was almost gross. And now we understand that the inner workings of the cell are incredibly complex. And there's a very definite structure within the cell. I mean, things aren't just floating around. Everything is attached. There's actually a skeleton inside the cell. It's called the cytoskeleton. And essentially, this skeleton gives the cell its structure where everything is attached and allows it to change shape and to move and to eventually also divide. And this skeleton is so important that, in fact, certain drugs against cancer are targeting the cytoskeleton. For example, Taxol. Some of you might have heard about Taxol. And what this does is it attacks the microtubules and disrupts the assembly of this cytoskeleton, and then the cell dies. And so we see that this structure is very important. And of course, all of us also are very aware of the importance of our own physical structure. There's an inner structure where you have rigid aspects such as bone and flexible aspects such as the tendons and the ligaments to allow the different movements that we're able to do. But we also have an outer component. We have the covering, the skin, that gives us the protection from the outside with all of the different senses that I just mentioned that allow us to interact with our environment. I had the opportunity to work on the osteoporosis program for about 7 years. I was actually the second chemist to be working on that project when I came to Montreal. And we've been able to develop a drug that essentially targets an enzyme that eats up bone tissue. Bone tissue is a living tissue. It's in equilibrium. And so when you have osteoporosis, the equilibrium is disrupted. It's pushed towards destruction. And so what we were able to do is to come up with a molecule that is going to prevent some of that destruction of the bone and to shift the equilibrium back to the right position. So we see once again the importance of all of these structures. But we're not just static in terms of human beings, we move. And we're not like a unicellular organism where we have a flagella, in the back that's turning around. That's not how we move around. It's quite a bit more complex. We need all of the muscles that are allowing these static portions to being able to move relative to one to another. How does this happen? Well, inside each muscle tissue, you have these molecules that are lined up that are going to use energy from the sugar in order to generate a microscopic, very, very small movement. And so there's a very small contraction that's possible. And in order for these muscles to move, what has to happen is that millions and billions of these cells, these muscle cells, are going to contract exactly at the same time, at the right moment, in order to produce movement. Once again, engineers know the importance of proper structure when you're building a building like this, or a plane, or a car, or a boat. You have to rely on special structures to do the job. And the same is true when engineers are designing engines, whether it's an electric motor or an internal combustion engine. All of these things that we're so proud of, that we know are so important in order to have function. But all these things pale into comparison when we compare with what we have inside the human body. I mean, none of these inventions we would ever dare to venture to say that they could appear on their own. What about these structures that are part of our bodies? Where did these things come from? Well, life is not self-sustaining. We've been talking about that with the first and the second law of thermodynamics. And so in order for us to being able to live, we need to consume. We need to take in certain things to allow the possibility of life. And so when we talked about the cell, we saw that the cell is able to absorb from its environment, either passively or actively, different nutrients from the environment in order to allow its possible life. And so when we're now looking at us, the higher organism, it is a completely different story. Think about it. If I take a chocolate bar and I place it in my hand, is my hand going to get fed? Are the cells going to absorb the sugars? Absolutely not, because these cells are locked inside the body. And so there has to have a new mechanism that is going to exist in the higher organisms where you're going to be able to feed yourself and then to have this food broken down and distributed to all of the cells. And so it's a whole different ballgame in order to feed the cells in this kind of system. And there's 3 different ways that we need to feed ourselves. I mean, first of all, there's air for the oxygen in order to do the combustion of the sugars to give us the necessary energy. And so this is done at the level of the lungs. One of the challenges, however, is that when you have a gas that needs to diffuse inside a liquid and you have a solid barrier in between the two, the exchange of gas is very inefficient. And yet we know how important oxygen is. And so there are 2 ways that are found inside the body to solve this problem. Number one is that our lungs are about the size of my fist here. That's about the size. But in order to extract the necessary amount of oxygen, you have to have a huge surface area. So we discover in the lungs these alveoles, these little structures that look like grapes. And what essentially these structures do is they increase the surface area, the contact of the blood vessels on the other side with the supply of fresh air. And if you were to take these two small lungs and to spread them out completely flat, they would be as big as the size of a badminton court. Imagine these two lungs, the size of a badminton court. And that's because of the structures that are found inside these lungs. And of course, the most important thing is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin, which is the molecule inside red blood cells that has that finely tuned iron ion that has just the right properties to capture oxygen from the air so that it can be brought to the cells, but just the right affinity strength so to release that oxygen once it gets to the tissues. So perfectly fine-tuned in order to do the job. But that's not the whole story. Also, when we talk about what we need to intake in order for life to be possible. All of us are familiar with eating and we enjoy that aspect of eating, but that's essentially what happens in here. There's a whole lot more going on when you talk about the intake of food. And we know that all of these things get broken down by those special enzymes that I talked about yesterday. In the presence of a very strong acidity, the stomach is going to generate hydrochloric acid, which is a very strong corrosive acid, and going to activate those enzymes. And together with the acidity and those enzymes, they're going to eat up everything that is in that stomach. So strong and corrosive is that environment that it would actually digest the stomach itself and all of the tissues around it. And so there's special cells within the stomach that are going to generate a barrier to protect the body from what it is doing inside that stomach. Quite amazing, quite impressive. And then all of those nutrients are sent into the intestines where the nutrients are going to be extracted. They're going to be brought into the rest of the body. And the same challenge exists there also, to have that transfer from that liquid through a solid barrier through the blood on the other side. And once again, we discover another type of structure, biological structure in the intestines. We call it the microvelocities that also are going to increase the surface area of the intestines. About 7 or 9 meters long are the intestines, so you can imagine how long that stretches out, all contained in this small area. And in fact, if you were to flatten out the intestines, it wouldn't be the size of a badminton court, it would be the size of a tennis court. So even larger in terms of its ability to have a maximum size to facilitate that absorption. And then we could also talk about the heart that is going to pump the blood that allows the carrying of all of these nutrients throughout the body. Finally, we move now to processing. Once things are brought inside the body, things come in, they're required for life, but eventually they need to go out. Sort of like when we say what comes up must come down, but it comes out in different form than the way that it came in. Very different form. And essentially what cells are able to do is they will directly take from their environment the things that they need, and they will also excrete right back into that environment the things that they do not want. So the waste gets directly released in the environment. I mean, we think we have body issues right now, but can you imagine that our bodies function that way? That we would just constantly be oozing all of the waste from our skin? I mean, that would not be aesthetic at all. This is not how the body functions. There's a different philosophy inside the body where it's going to collect and basically keep that waste in specific areas for temporary discharge. Again, higher organisms requires a whole new way in which you're going to deal with these different principles. And so, I just want to point out 2 organs here that I find absolutely fantastic. The first is the kidney. People would usually think, well, the kidney, how boring the kidney is. Absolutely not. It has an interesting philosophy, the kidney. This is how the scientists talk about these organs. The philosophy of the kidney is that instead of figuring out what it wants to keep from the blood, it basically kicks everything out. Everything that's water soluble with a lot of water, so the blood gets really, really thick, puts everything out. And then on its way back from the tube here, it's going to say, I want to keep this, I want to keep this, I want to keep this, and at the end picks up all the water that it can, and the rest just goes to discharge. A wonderful, efficient philosophy that allows it to clean the blood as it does. Now this organ here, the liver, has been an enemy of mine for many, many years, because when you work in the drug industry, you spend all this time, making these beautiful molecules that have biological activity, then you put it into the people or in the animals for the testing, and the liver recognizes these molecules and says, hey, that's not supposed to be there, and starts destroying them, changing them, and then completely removing them from the body. But that is a very important job, because this is able to recognize certain things that the liver, that the kidney is going to miss, and essentially monitor what's going on in the blood and to remove all the things that don't belong there, what we would call xenobiotics. Next we have preservation. We know that life is difficult in our culture and our society, that you got to be careful where you go and who you mix with and what you do. Well, the same thing is true when it comes to life. Preservation. There's a constant battle that is required in order for life to be possible. And when we talked about the cell, we talked about how there are these mechanisms that are able to recognize when something is broken, like there's errors in the DNA, and to recruit the necessary equipment in order to fix the problem that exists. And we see similar kind of systems that are at work in the body. If you cut yourself, that the blood clotting cascade is going to begin in order to prevent you bleeding out. And then all of the necessary mechanisms are then started in order for the healing to occur. The same is even true with structures such as bones being able to mend back together after having been broken. And there's even more going on within the body, because there's all of these enemies all over the place. They can be viruses or bacteria or natural cells of ours that are gone wrong. And so we have different types of cells, such as the white blood cells, that are constantly monitoring the blood and the tissues, looking for anything that doesn't belong there. And as soon as it recognizes something that doesn't belong there, it will start to manufacture these special molecules called antibodies that are going to target these pathogens, these aliens, and essentially mark them out for destruction. And so there's a whole system that exists in order to make sure that these invaders are kept out. Last, but definitely not least, is continuation. This is the sixth aspect of life. And I think everyone in this room here knows that you're not going to start at some point in your life dividing in two. That's just not the way that it happens with higher organisms, such as it does for cells. In fact, it is quite a different mechanism, a much more interesting one I would argue, that essentially allows life to continue at the level of higher organisms. And this is something that is incredibly complex, because it involves many different levels. First of all, at the cellular level, in those sex cells, in order to generate new organisms requiring a man and a woman, a male and a female, there's some amazing stuff happening that is called not mitosis, which is the division of the cell by replicating all of the DNA. It's something very different. It's basically taking all of the original cell's DNA and trimming it down to about 50% of what it had, so that one day it could meet an other cell from the other sex, from male and female, which has also another 50%, which these two then would meet together and complete each other by making a new organism with all of the different traits that can be inherited. That's what's happening at the level of the cellular stage. At the physiological level, there's also a whole bunch of amazing things that are happening within the body of the woman as she is preparing to give birth to that child. All of the changes in her anatomy, the preparation of milk for the child who is to come. I've also read that there's an enzyme that is secreted late during the 9 months that is going to start to digest some of the ligaments inside the pelvic bone area in order to increase the flexibility in order for the head of the baby to being able to go through. I mean, that enzyme's purpose for being is to do that one thing in order for the head to being able to go through. I mean, talk about complex design here in order for just one baby to be born. Just absolutely amazing. And then you also have the newborn's perspective, because that baby, once it's born, needs to have all of the instincts in order for it to be able to survive. First of all, to take that gas of air, to breathe, even as it has still all of this liquid inside of its lung, to have the right reflex to push that out and to start bringing air in. That has to be inbuilt. And then you also have the reflex to want to eat. If the child is born but does not want to eat, nothing can be done for the child, etc., etc., etc. And so evolution not only requires us to believe that from inanimate matter we got to the cell, but that the cell somehow got on its own over time to something like this, where you would have the appearance of man and woman without man and woman. How can man and woman evolve if they didn't come from man and woman? You can't even begin to imagine some sort of fictitious idea as to how that would be possible. And yet this is what is being taught as if it's a fait accompli in many of the places where we are going in our culture and our society. So as we step back and we look at the big picture, and we see that indeed there is a huge gap between the single cell, as complex as it is, in order to eventually reach the level of higher organisms. And this is not the end of the story, because we talked about irreducible complexity within the cell. And we said about how all of these processes, all of these mechanisms, all of these structures have to be there and functional in order for the cell to be able to exist. Well, on top of that, that means that all of these cells need to be able to come together in order to form a tissue. But a tissue on its own cannot allow life. It needs to be associated with other tissues like itself and different from itself in order to make organs. But the failure of just one tissue leads to organ failure, which leads to death. And one organ on its own, take any one of these organs, is not sufficient for life. And it has to be coupled with all of these other organs in order to make what we would call a system. Any single organ that goes under failure will lead to the failure of the system, which leads to death in most cases. And one system on its own, there's many different systems that need to be working inside the body. One system on its own is insufficient to support life. Any system that falls apart, that breaks apart, is going to lead to failure, which is going to lead to death. So we see that life is an association of interdependent, irreducibly complex system at every single level. And you need to have all of these aspects together that are functional in order for higher life to be possible. And this is not the end. You might think, well, this is the conclusion. No, it keeps going on. Because in fact, even having a higher organism on its own is insufficient. We need each other in order for us to be able to live. And not only do we need each other, we need other kinds of life forms in order for the cycle of life to be possible, ecosystem. And on top of that, it's not just other animals, but plants that are necessary in order for higher organisms to be able to live. And it goes on and on, not just on the biotic side, meaning life, but also on the abiotic side, which is talking about the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the energy cycle. It goes on and on and on. All of these things have to be in place in the planet in order for all of this to be possible. Does it keep going? Absolutely it keeps going, because you even need beyond this earth a source of energy that is going to be there and constant and sufficient in order to allow all of these things to be possible. So as we step back and we look at this, we're like, wow, is it really possible to propose something that allows us to go from all of these different aspects to who we are today? Again, this is the question that each and every one needs to answer. Now I'm going to move to the last part of this presentation, and this section here is called Biology and Beyond. And so now we go into the and beyond. Isaac Asimov said the following thing. He said, man is a 3-pound brain, which as far as we know is the most complex and orderly arrangement of matter anywhere in universe. But again, we have to ask the question, even with all the complexity that we find within the brain, being the most complex arrangement of matter in universe, is that sufficient to explain who we are as human beings? That's the next question. Can all of this complexity explain free will, our intelligence, our ability to have emotion, to know the difference between right and wrong? Can we reduce human life to being simply molecules and cells sending information, and that's it? Or is there more? And this is something that has puzzled scientists. And I must say that they have been quite honest in saying to the point at which they are puzzled. And the following quotation comes from Nature. This is Nichols and Newsom. Listen carefully to what they say. The crux of the problem lies in our personal freedom and moral responsibility. If our mental lives, who we are determined by the molecular and cellular events that generate electrical activity in the nervous system, here's the question. What are we to make of our subjective experience of freedom? We have no solution to this problem. Paul Davies, in another article when he was talking about this, he laid out the 6 greatest mysteries in the world of physics, the greatest difficulties that we have to explain different things around us. And then he got to the last one, the 7th one. And that 7th one, the greatest mystery was the following. How is it that I can ask these questions? How is it that I can ask these questions? This is a great mystery. The more we think about it, the more imponderable it becomes. Where comes this ability? Think about it. If I take this substance here, this pen, this laser, and I lift it up and I let it go, it's going to fall. Does it make a choice? Is it making a choice? Is there any freedom? No, it is obeying laws. But if I am saying, according to the material reduction viewpoint of life, that I am simply molecules and cells put together, and I am built for something that has no ability to choose, that has no freedom, then where comes my ability from being able to choose? It would mean that when I say I love my son, or I love my daughter, or I love my wife, it's just as much as this pen chooses to go down to the ground. You see? That creates a lot of problems because we know in our regular experience that this is not who we are, that we are able to make decisions, that we are able to think, that we are able to have emotions. Where does this come from, though, if we are strictly matter and energy? That's the challenge. Throughout my years, as I've been struggling with these questions, I spent a lot more time reading what the atheists and what the evolutionists believe, because I want to have all of the information. I want to make sure that whatever I stand upon is solid, and I want all of the facts. And one day I was at Merck in the research library, going through the library, and I saw a book that was called The Evolution of the Human Brain. And it was written by John Eccles. John Eccles is a Nobel Prize winner for his research on the evolution of the human brain. And as I was reading his book, trying to see what he's saying and what the data is, I got at the end of the book. This is like page 250. You'll see the reference. And here's what I found at the end of his book. This is what he said. Since materialist solutions fail to account for our experience uniqueness, I am constrained to attribute the uniqueness of the self or soul to a supernatural spiritual creation. And listen to what he says after. I submit that no other explanation is acceptable. The reality is, folks, that there are a lot of scientifically minded people that have grappled with these questions, that have studied the data, and that have come to the conclusion that there has to be something more, that the answer cannot lie in matter and energy alone, that there has to be something more. The problem is that in our culture, in our society today, if you do not toe the line, which is the official statement that a lot of the people, a lot of the universities, a lot of the media has accepted, that you are going to be ostracized. But let me tell you that there are a lot of scientists who beg to differ with the official line. Now, I am now one of them, and that creates problems. But I believe that the truth needs to be brought out there. And again, my goal is not to convince anyone. My goal is to bring the information. So whether you choose to go one direction or the other, at least you will have all of the data to make an informed decision. That is the goal. That is the purpose. Here we have an image that is not far from where I grew up. This is Hopewell Rocks in New Brunswick. And this is one of the World Heritage Sites in the world because we can see how the great tides, coupled with wind and sand and the currents and all these things, have been able to sculpt very interesting rock formations, all by natural processes. And so the question is, would you believe that all of these natural forces over time would be able to sculpt something that looks a little bit like this? Nobody would dare to suggest that wind, water, ice and cold would be able to sculpt something like this. But wait a second, if we believe the theory of evolution, we're basically saying that over millions and millions of years, not just faces in a rock that have no ability to think or to feel or to choose, but real faces with brains behind them that have the ability to feel, to think, to know the difference between right and wrong, that has appeared on its own? Is that a reasonable conclusion to come to? Is that the foundation upon which we stand? Or do we recognize that that is insufficient and there has to be something more in order to explain who we are at every single aspect? Some of you might say at this point, well, listen, Your story sounds kind of convincing, but we know that there are a lot of good scientists out there who really disagree with you, and that's the case. And so if the evidence is so convincing, why is creation not being more seriously considered? That is an excellent question, that is an important question, and it needs to be answered. And part of the answer exists in the fact that even before the theory of evolution was framed, there was something else that existed in our society, another belief system that is called atheism. But atheism was not very fulfilling, because how could it explain the reality of life and all the things that we just talked about? It was not fulfilling. And so it needed something to prop it up, to give it substance, to make it more believable. And so Richard Dawkins said the following. He said, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. In other words, is it the science that is driving our philosophy, our ideology? Or is it our ideology, our philosophy, that is driving the interpretation of scientific data? That's the question that we have to ask. Which one comes first? But what if the evidence is pointing in the other direction, as you are trying to say today? You know, you're saying the evidence is pointing in that direction. Don't they see that the evidence is pointing in that direction? Should they not go wherever the evidence leads them? Well, let's listen to the following quote, which again comes from Nature. Listen carefully. Even if all the data points to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science. But why? Why would it be excluded? Because it is not naturalistic. Aha! There is a preconceived notion. There is an a priori statement that we are starting from that causes us to reject what the evidence is pointing to. Richard Lewontin, the famous geneticist from Harvard University, said, "We have a prior commitment to materialism that is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." We reject anything that points to a creator right off the bat. It cannot be accepted. But why is that? Why is that? This points to a vicious cycle. There's a common saying in scientific circle that is this: nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. Nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. How can you arrive to such a blanket statement for this? Well, if you start with the position that only materialistic explanations are acceptable, and you look around and you discover that evolution is the only materialistic explanation that fits the bill and that brings a theory, then of course, only evolution can make sense of biology. There's a vicious cycle here. There's a tautology that is happening. And what's driving this vicious cycle? It is atheism. It is the preconceived ideology that then latches on to this scientific information and uses it to prop up its own agenda, its own ideology. Are we listening carefully to the data, or are we projecting our own thoughts and opinions upon that data? For a long time, people pushed back to the idea of creation because they said science is eventually going to answer all of our questions. You believe in God right now because you have ignorance about certain things. And so where you have ignorance, you just put God. This is called the God of the gaps. You have gaps in your knowledge, you have gaps in your understanding, and you put God wherever the gaps are. Well, I have to make an important distinction. There's the mechanisms of life, and then there's the origins of life. Those are two completely different things. And so yes, it is true that we were very ignorant by a lot of the mechanisms of life. And people said, well, it's God, well, it's God, well, it's God. And it wasn't. It was what is created and how things work. But when we examine not how the mechanisms of life function, but the question regarding the origins of life, we see that the gap that exists in order to be able to go from inanimate matter to animate matter to what we've been talking about today, as scientific knowledge increases, the gap is not decreasing, it is increasing. It is increasing. And so what that leads us to is not the God of the gaps, but the atheism of the gaps. While creation appeals to a non-observable phenomenon, in other words, a singularity that is outside, beyond space, time, and matter, it does so not as a function of gaps in our knowledge, but as a function of the extent of our knowledge. And on the other side of the coin, while evolution also appeals to a non-observable phenomenon, something that happened in the distant past over millions and millions of years, a singularity, but now not outside, within space, time, and matter. It does so in a manner that is not only at odds with observation, but that also violates basic scientific principles. Yes, it is a matter of fate. It doesn't matter, again, whether you're on one side or the other. But the question is, what is the quantity, what is the quality of the evidence upon which you stand as a foundation for whatever fate that you have? That's the question that we have to answer. Now I come to my last slide. Again, Escher, another beautiful, interesting diagram that seems to make sense, right? But then you start looking at it and you say, well, wait a second, this doesn't work because this violates basic principles. The theory of evolution is a scientific theory. That is a serious theory that must be considered, that must be answered. And it seems to being able to explain things that we see all around us. But when you start carefully examining the data and going into the interpretations that are brought, you discover that there are problems. Just like we did in our first part, that there's a gap between inanimate matter and animate matter. And there's nothing within the physical laws that allows us to bridge this gap. That the cell, with all the complexity that we find within it, cannot just arise on its own. Furthermore, the information content that we see within the cell is not something that can spontaneously appear. And now we looked at higher organisms and how indeed the gap that exists between the single cell and higher organisms is not something that can be bridged by appealing to all of the data and all of the laws that we have before us. And so does this evidence disprove evolution? No, but it doesn't support it. Does this prove creation? No, it doesn't prove it, but it's pointing in that direction. And so now I'm going to stop here and we're going to come back for the last final presentation, which is going to focus on the power and the limitation of science, what it can tell us, what it can't tell us, and what we're going to be looking at in terms of those fundamental questions. Thank you.